Well, what a privilege it is to talk to everyone today. As Alvaro was joking earlier, it is kind of ironic that I'm giving a talk on finding silence. As a head of a middle school, as my wife Mary Margaret and I, we've been raising our 6 children for 20 years. I think I'm not an expert on silence. I'm an expert on the need for silence. So it's great to be here. And if any part of my talk today, if any of it is something that you appreciate or something that you would like to talk more about, I'd be happy to. But please know that anything in the talk that you appreciate is probably thanks to my wife, Mary Margaret. She's inspired so much of this talk. I'd like to dedicate the talk to her. So the actual focus of this talk is how do we aim to provide foundational ways of living as a family that can reasonably support a life of prayer. So if there's anything that as parents we want to give our children, it's going to be, and we want to give them everything, right? It's going to be the eternal things. There's very few things we can give them in this life that are eternal. So a life of prayer is the best hope we have to be giving them eternal grace, right? So how do we lay a foundation for that? How do we make it so that they can have a life of prayer? And that's the talk today. I'll take you through some principles to start, and then we'll move into sort of 5 areas that I think are foundational to being able to have the mind and the heart and the soul that's able to pray. So I think this is probably in some ways, that this is very much at the heart of our work as parents. And before I get started, I just think it's good to remember that as a group of parents, we're going to fall short, right? So that's a really good thing to know, right? At the outset. We live our lives, I think, and so do our sons and daughters, thinking about success, whether it be academically for our children, athletically, we think about success, like things work out the way we want them to work out. The reality is that I think parenting is much akin to the spiritual life. The fact is that parenting is one of those struggles where we're going to have to not make it about perfect success. There's no way to think about this effort as, well, I did it really well, we won. It's not going to be that type of an effort. Just like the spiritual life, you're not going to be able to ever say that. So it's good to frame shift your mind when you're in this space, thinking about these things, because it's not about perfect success. It's about faithfulness to the mission. It's about devotion to this effort, right? And in that faithfulness is the only place we're going to find success. And any success we encounter is not going to be our own. It's definitely going to be the hand of God using us as instruments. So it's really good to remember that we're not doing this alone, that we're not going to be perfectly successful. But in fact, if we are successful, it's going to be because we were faithful. We kept at it. We didn't give up. We were devoted. And that devotion allowed us to be open to grace. So that's probably the most important principle. I could end my talk now, but we're going to delve into some practical things too. Good news is that you're surrounded by other intentional families who are trying to do this. So you're not the only parent in this room trying to do this. That's great. And as Alvaro was saying, you need to find people in your sons' lives and daughters' lives who can confirm the way that you're raising them. We do refer to it through the faculty as the great confirmation that parents are raising their sons here in an intentional way, and we're trying to confirm the way that you're raising them. That's the great privilege of working at the Heights, and it's truly at the heart, the core of our work. Now, I also think a principle that's good to remember is that this effort of passing on our faith and encouraging a life of prayer is not always going to be direct. In fact, the reason it's not going to be direct most of the time is that what they really need to do is they need to see things, evidence of trust in our life, evidence of spiritual trust. So when we aim to pass on the faith to our children, in many ways, it can't just be about a prescribed set of actions. In fact, I think it's probably more about our own way of living our spiritual life and what they observe in us, that where we can impart the faith to them. So once they see the trust, once they see, I once was talking to an alumni, he remembers vividly seeing his dad on his knees praying, just how important that moment was for him. It's a physical thing that he saw, right? And he was coming in, and his dad was in the chapel kneeling, right? That speaks better than any set of words, right? So it's the way that our kids, what they see in us, that's going to be how we ultimately pass on the faith, not just a series of actions or everything we say to them. And you got to be careful not to overtalk this topic, right? You never want it to be white noise. Less is more. It's more about what they see. Now, the other thing, a sort of foundational principle before we get started in the 5 foundations that I'm going to talk to you about today is that when you ask your children, do you believe that prayer is necessary? This is not an actual question you're going to say, but if you were to ask them, do you believe prayer is necessary? What would be their answer? Is it in the category of, it would be a really good thing on a good day? Or for your family, is it in the category of, it's like oxygen? Yeah, it's not a when we get around to it. It's essential. It's something that it's so important to just sort of the way we live, that a life of prayer and living our faith is something that is not sort of an on-again, off-again moment. So you got to think about, that's not something you might say to your kids, but it might be something that they see, right? They might actually see in us, well, it's not convenient, but we find a way to get to Mass. Or, yep, we're going to leave the mess in the kitchen, and we might, at this point, pull away for the rosary. And, everything else doesn't have to be perfect, but we're going to keep this routine. That's really important. That's something that they need to see. So, if it's hard to find the time, if it's hard to find the peace, start small. Start in small, committed ways. It's not a luxury, a life of prayer. Okay, so we'll talk now about 5 foundations. These are sort of the things that your child can one day freely build a life of prayer on. The first is, I think generosity and devotion, they're linked. All right, so generosity, devotion is linked. I believe that all of us have patterns, and the way we think about things, we often develop a choice between self-focus and focus on all that is greater than the self. So in our family lives, it's very easy to recognize that when we are self-focused, when we're focused on justice, or I can't believe my son did this, I'm so frustrated, or if we take that approach, that's going to lead to despair. That's going to lead to ingratitude. And that's a temptation, even during a life of prayer. If you start your own prayer with a sense of what's wrong, that's a mistake. That's a mistake, I think, for all of us, right? So what do we have to do? We want to get outside of the self-focus. The happiest people we know are people who are not self-focused, right? But that's a temptation. That's something that will pull down and distract us in a life of prayer. So it's hard, but we probably need to start with gratitude. What is good? Right? We often say to our teachers, the art of teaching is really seeing the good in your students. Right? The art of parenting is the same, seeing the good in your children. Right? That sense of optimism, that sense of hope, that's an essential part of doing this job. And just like you will fall short, they will fall short. So how do you respond to that with a sense of hope? That's really critical. So our closeness and our awareness of our family, this is a major fundamental orientation towards reality that they're going to get from our family unit. If we help our children aim at generosity, aim at gratitude, we're going to help them do that, I think, through our own example more than anything else. So, our faith ultimately is not just a part of our life. It's actually the answer to the question of living. Foundation number 2, being capable of extraordinary attentiveness to those that we love. Why? I think that's easier for many of us as a parent. I don't know about you, but the truth is when one thing's for sure, one of the things I can look back and say, working with thousands of really intentional parents, like parents love their children. I mean, that's the truth, right? We love our children. We would do anything for our children. Right? What a gift that is. That's the heart of a father. That's the heart of a mother. So sometimes it's easier for us to be attentive on an extraordinary level to those who we love than it is to have extraordinary attentiveness in a life of prayer, isn't it? Because here is this child. I mean, we have some babies walking around in the back, like here's this child. We were given this child. I think back to when your very first moment when you held your child. What an incredibly grace-filled moment. Think back to maybe when you were at the altar, right? And at your wedding, what a grace-filled moment. These are extraordinary moments, right? You look back. It's easy to give an extraordinary amount of attention and love to those who we're most committed to. Start there. I think because those patterns of extraordinary closeness, I truly believe that is a great first step to training our children, the awareness of others, to be able to have an extraordinary attentiveness in their prayer life. Have you ever seen like an older sibling hold a younger sibling? And just how the older siblings take care of younger siblings, just the amount of love that they have. That's incredible training for the prayer life. Right? When you held your first child, your heart doubled in size. You can't quite explain how, or you didn't understand parenting until you were a parent, right? But when that happened, what a gift that was, right? Very easy at that point to see all the goodness. Maybe it's another conference where we're talking about like from that path to the teenage years, right? But there's this opportunity, I think, to strengthen the life of prayer and the contemplative life through this extraordinary love that we have for those who we're closest to. So that's another foundation. The truth is that what's the risk to that? I think we have some risk. The risk here is actually that, and it starts with our spouse. There's a lot of exterior noise. There's a lot of distraction in our world. Distraction from what matters most to us, right? So there's a gradual erosion sometimes in our attentiveness to others. So this core of the family unit, we want to be very careful through all this exterior noise and all this distraction that we're not living life on autopilot, on screens, and not searching for some deeper meaning or purpose or beauty in this life that we've been given. We want to avoid being at some point alone together. That's a real risk, I think, in today's society, with all the external noise that we have to sort of sift through. So there's definitely an overemphasis on doing in our families. Making it all happen is the mantra of the modern day parent. Right? We pull off this remarkable and probably stress-filled juggling act, but in the end, we can end up not even giving this extraordinary attention to the people that we love. At the end of the day, you might think, well, how much actual focus did I spend on what mattered most to me? The people under this roof, right? So that's a really good thing to keep an eye on, because we're so busy. That's what you ask friends, how are you doing? Doing well, really busy. How often do we hear that, right? So let's try to look deeper at those who we love and make ourselves available to them. For instance, when do we talk to our children? When do our children know that we're available to talk? That's a really important thing. I know a dad who didn't want a dog. The kids were lobbying for a dog. Parents were lobbying for it. Mom was lobbying for a dog. Didn't like dogs for some reason. But he said, sure, no problem, as long as every night I'll walk the dog, but at least one of my children has to walk it with me. That was a great moment to tie the time together as a dad with a child, on the dog schedule, right? But that's a great thing. That was a masterful move. Or the dad who, another masterful move, the dad who's like, yes, I need to do some yard work today, but finds a way to incorporate his kids into this and talk to them and show them as they're working, right? Same is true with mom. Moms have a special way of doing this. I think in some ways they can multitask better than we can, but just, how do we avoid this classic Martha Mary moment, right? With our own families, that closeness, that togetherness. We want to avoid the overemphasis on doing. And what ends up happening is, where do we see this especially? What's most important, that the core of the family unit is our marriage. That should, somehow, and the busyness and the taking care of all the children, often what ends up happening is our spouses, what's the real risk? The real risk is what Sheldon Van Auken in A Severe Mercy describes as creeping separateness, right? The creeping separateness that can take place. The taking of love for granted. It's ceasing to do things together. It's ceasing to be aware of the needs of the other. It's a gradual thing, a gradual sort of erosion. You got to watch for that in all the busyness too, right? So that may be, I encourage you at this conference, something like this, you get a lot of ideas thrown at you. Pick one and really stick with it. Make that a part of your own nightly exam and just think about, how am I doing in this one area? But this is definitely a big one. I think just talking with lots of families and seeing, a couple, marries, becomes one. And at first there's great communication, togetherness, romance. Then children start coming, life gets busier, carpools, all these things are going on, work, commitments. And then we have to watch out that he doesn't just do his thing and she does hers. And in the end, they stop communicating, except about what really matters. So make that time for each other. So I guess the question is not, when do our children know that they can talk to us? When does our spouse know that we can talk? That's really, I think, a key question. Again, that's foundational, because here's a key connection, I believe, is that we can only give what we have. Right? So I believe that what we really want is that we want our children to be able to live their vocation well. Well, we're the closest. Most of them, they're going to have a vocation to marriage. We're a very close example to that. And so to live the vocation well, the way our children live their vocation is going to answer how well they live their life. We may seem that, we want all the best things in life for our children, but what we really want is for them to live their vocation well. Pray to the Holy Family that your children live their vocation well. You can't think about living our vocation well without a life of prayer. I don't think it's possible. Right? So again, prayer is like oxygen. It's a necessity for our lives. It is not something that's good when we can get to it. St. Josemaria has been quoted saying, the first and most important lesson for a child to learn at an early age is that daddy loves mommy very much. So think about and pray about the types of marriages you'd want your own children to have. Right? Try to be that spouse. And if that's their vocation, try to be that example. So there's a great book by Cardinal Sarah called The Power of Silence. And he highlights that there's really there's an incredible need for silence. I think a good way to think about this is just like one example. There's lots of distractions. There's lots of external noise and internal noise that we have to deal with in our life of prayer. But let me just give you one example. It's not from the book, but let's just imagine, for instance, this is an example of external noise. Let's think about, if I could draw a timeline back here on this wall, and I draw this timeline of all of human history. Right? And at the very end of the timeline is where we are today. Just an eyelash of that timeline is the timeline of, the moment when human beings started to be screen saturated. Right? So that's what we are. We're screen saturated. Okay. That's a little bit of an experiment, I think, on the human race, don't you think? And we've seen this. We see how it sort of draws us in. Screens do. And you see your children's eyes when they're watching TV. If you haven't noticed, look at them, the TV eyes. They're not fully alive. It's a lot different when you have them on a hike. You look at their eyes from the side. They're different, right? So we want to awaken in them what it really means to be human. It's probably not going to be found on a screen. Right? If you think about the amount of time that human beings, for all of human history, did not spend on a screen versus the time they're spending on a screen. Now, that's a profound moment, right? I think we have to fight that experiment to the extent that is reasonable and possible, right? And I think every family needs a plan for that, because that screen saturation is a direct opposite of what we see people need, which means an extraordinary attentiveness to each other and to God. So that's something to keep an eye on. But Cardinal Sarah, this great book, The Power of Silence, Against the Dictatorship of Noise. He says, he describes external and silence and solitude, and he talks about the need for external silence. So that's kind of shutting down all of these distractions in our life, or at least having windows where we shut that down. And then finding interior silence, internal silence. Now, one of the things he says it's paradoxical, because as soon as we shut down the external noise, we have some external silence. So as soon as you go into the chapel, right, and sit down and, okay, now we're actually have some external silence. Now we have to deal with the interior noise. This is real. All the distraction in our life of prayer. And that's why so many kids, have a hard time with a life of prayer. Because even when they can put it all away and actually try to listen, they're distracted. There's this internal noise. So this is foundation number 3. Talk to our children about the things that might distract them. Be aware of the inner thoughts when they do go to a life of prayer. What is it they're going to have to struggle with? And just be aware of that. I'm going to give you a few examples. It's so important that as parents we see the world as our child sees it. Try to remember back when you were their age, a teenager, a young man, a young woman, a young boy, a young girl. But prayer, when we are younger, it's often a matter of confirming. It's seeking the confirmation and the affirmation that we were made good as a son, seeking this assurance. It helps tremendously when we receive the same assurance from our own parents. So, on the mind of every child is, are they good? They might be asking a question like, what am I good at? But am I good is a much more fundamental question, right? And they're going to get that answer from us as parents. At some point, there's this inflection point in a child's life, and it's probably earlier than we think. And this is a moment when they make their faith their own. Often it's, talking to boys, there's a moment in which they make it not their family's faith, but their own faith, right? Sometimes it's at a point when they lose someone who they love. This is a key question for them. They might lose a grandfather or grandmother, and in this moment when someone who they love that they've lost, and they have to come to the better understanding of what has happened and where is this person, right? That's a key moment. That's an inflection point, right? This is where, yes, you have faith, or you don't, right? And I think that often this inflection point, they say, is younger than we think. People, so early on, they need this sort of foundation of prayer, but they have this restlessness. I think we do too, right? When we go to the chapel, there's going to be a restlessness. We got to be aware of that interior noise. It's going to be there. So we have to realize that we were made for prayer. This is the good news. Our children were made for prayer. We're restless until we rest in God. It's written into our hearts. It's our nature. We need connectivity to God through prayer. And we need connectivity to each other as well. So what do we do? A show of, how do we handle this restlessness, this distractedness that's going to be a part of our life of prayer? And how do we equip our children to recognize that that's going to happen? Just like a show of hands, how many people struggle with this? Everybody's hand's going to be in the air, right? And the truth is that I think so. St. Josemaria puts it really well. You're distracted in prayer. This is point 890 of the way. Try to avoid distractions, but don't worry if in spite of everything, your mind still wanders. Don't you see how in ordinary life, even the most considerate children play with the things about them and often pay no attention to what their father is saying? This does not imply a lack of love or respect. It is the weakness and the littleness peculiar to a child. Then look, you are a child before God. So you still win, right? You're still there. You're a child before God. Maybe distracted, but you're still like a child before God. I think that when we think about the way a father or mother loves their children, that's the closest reflection that a child can understand about the Father's love. So our Father loves us tremendously, more than we can possibly understand. How do we help communicate that to our children? The closest way we can do that is through our own love for them, which is self-sacrificial, right? Which is devoted, right? So somehow we have to communicate that through our own human love to our children. I think there's a lot of restlessness that children deal with. I think in their life of prayer, they're probably, I think self-consciousness tends to dominate a lot the thoughts of many youth. That's when they have the quiet, finally, when they have the silence, when they have the moment, when they have a chance to reflect and have a contemplative moment. The truth is that there's a pattern of knots that they have to kind of untie, the self-consciousness. We don't want our children to have a big desire to conform. Conforming, is probably pretty dangerous when we think about faithfulness today, right? We want them to be willing to be independent, to stand alone, to freely choose what is good, right? Another temptation that I think our children and we also can create internal noise is this despair that's the result of sinfulness. It's this idea that if, as Alvaro was saying, this idea that you have to struggle. But our children, they hit the first moment, or maybe the second moment, or the third moment of sin, and then they begin to say, well, this means that I'm not good. And this pattern is such that I'm not worthy of forgiveness. This is one you really got to watch for. This sense of despair in the face of sin, right? As parents, we have to watch for this one. And the answer to this question on the child's mind is, am I good? Am I good enough? This answer to this question is a spiritual answer. And the people who he trusts the most, his mom and his dad, the people who love him the most in this world, is where he's going to get that answer. So, I think fundamentally, we need to communicate optimism to our children. We need to communicate that they were made good in the image and likeness of God, that he will never fail to redeem us, even in our own weakness. In fact, it's good to communicate to our children that there's a radical reliance that you have on grace. As a parent, if they see, okay, my parents, they're not perfect, but they're pretty good people. I look up to them. They have a radical reliance on grace. and I'm very much this work in progress, so I'm going to need a radical reliance on grace. That's a very logical thing for our kids to see that. And we have every reason to hope because we're not doing this alone. I think that's important. Again, I just want to remind folks at this point in the talk, like, you're not doing this alone. Right? You can do this. Even though it's incredibly challenging and it's incredibly important, you can do this because God wants you to be able to do this. God wants you to pass on a life of prayer to your children. He wants your children to find hope in your family. All right, the next foundation is recognizing the external noise, but then the power of contemplative patterns. How do we do this? Well, let's think about this. The fact is that when Cardinal Sarah says this line, from morning to evening, silence no longer has any place at all. The noise tries to prevent God himself from speaking. In this hail of noise, man disintegrates and can become lost. He's broken up into countless worries, fantasies, and fears in order to get out of this tendency. He desperately awaits noise, so it might bring him a few consolations. Noise is deceptive, it's addictive, and it's a false tranquilizer. Too few Christians are willing to go into silence. I believe that we have a quiet mind and this unsettled, frenetic mind in every one of us. We have the capacity for both, right? I think that's what we were made for. We were made for reflective patterns, but we're also made to be able to do things. And if you think about the quiet mind versus the frenetic mind, the frenetic mind is this mind of, got to get everything done. It's 5 different thoughts at once. The quiet mind is a mind that's capable of longer thoughts. The quiet mind is the mind that we're going to appreciate nature with, to take in a beautiful sunset. The quiet mind is going to be the mind that we appreciate beautiful music with, or art. It's a mind that we're going to read with. It's a mind we're going to appreciate poetry with. It's a mind that we're going to rock our baby with. This is the quiet mind. The quiet mind, good news, is the same. All these things are attractive to us, right? We need this quiet mind. But that's the same mind that we're going to pray with. So it naturally means that we need to create these same kind of patterns in the lives of our children. What are the patterns where your children can learn to slow down, to notice things, to appreciate beauty? Right? I once came up and there was a boy standing up in the courtyard and the sun was rising. It was an early morning. He had been dropped off. He was standing on the stone wall. I remember him standing there and taking in the sunrise. It was a beautiful sunrise, and I came up and we sort of stood there and we looked at it together. And he said, "It's purple." He's just sort of, it's purple. I thought to myself, like, that's so good. This is such a good sign for this kid that he's standing here looking at a sunset. What a beautiful moment. How many people walk right by that, right? Or these cherry blossoms. What do you do with that, right? Do you stop and notice it? Do you look closely at it? Or do you walk right by it, right? So we need to develop this quiet mind in our children. We often talk about, how we study or learn nature here or the arts. What we're really trying to do is what I think parents are trying to do. They're trying to train the eyes and the minds of students to appreciate beauty, to notice the details in nature, to look deeper. And when we can do that, it's going to help us to pray. The opposite is the unsettled mind, and it wears itself out. It constantly exhausts itself. This is the unsettled sort of frenetic pattern. Everything from surfing the internet to television to these constantly changing colorful imagery that we see. What's our next bit of stimulation, right? As opposed to actually appreciating something beautiful, right? I think we're made for the quiet mind. So the key connection, again, the vital connection about why we need contemplation is that this mind that we read with, we appreciate music with, that we see beauty in nature with, and appreciate the visual arts, it's the same mind that we think deeply, and it's the same mind that we pray with. We need that so badly today in society. And I would say whatever you can do, and start small, but whatever you can do to introduce the patterns of a quiet mind into your family life, definitely find ways to do that, whether it be hiking, whether it be, everything from that to painting with your children, to listening to beautiful music as a family. Ideally, what you really want is to be a great moment when you can see that they appreciate something beautiful, that they internalize it, right? And then they try to create something beautiful, right? You see that in kids who are trying to paint something, or it's someone who listens to a beautiful piece of music and then tries to play it on their own instrument, right? Any way you can help them internalize the beauty and try to participate in the beauty, that's golden. So we have to help develop these patterns of focus on what is beautiful. And here's the good news. Even though we're drawn, I think, towards these frenetic patterns, the truth is that our prayer life recenters us on looking deeper at the world, and looking deeper at each other, right? For starters, do you see the beauty in your own family? Right? Take time to do that. Take time to appreciate that. That's so important. I mean, the beauty of a newborn babe and the way that other children in your family are drawn to that baby. I mean, that's the quiet mind. So 3 things here about this. First, you have to slow down before you can even realize that you needed to slow down. Have you ever gone on a retreat before? If you haven't, it's a great idea. But not until you get to the retreat. I think there's often like this activation energy. You have to get over the hill of okay, I'm still going to go on the retreat, even though I have all these other things going on in life and all these other busy things. I'm still going to go because I've been there before and I've made a mental note that I needed this more than I probably realized. And you don't realize that you need a retreat usually until you're on the retreat. And then you realize, wow, I really needed to go on this retreat. Support each other in that. I know that's hard when you have all of a sudden your spouse disappears and goes on a retreat, right? That can be challenging, but trust me, it's 100% worth it, because they come back and they have a refreshed commitment to the quiet mind, to these deeper, more contemplative patterns. And so it's not a luxury, it's something that we all need. But until you actually make time for a contemplative life, you don't realize how much you needed it. The second, people who live a contemplative life are probably actually more productive than people with the unsettled, frenetic mind. So what that means that when you are a parent who thinks, okay, I got to get it all done, actually you have this multiplication of time when you can have more focus, more contemplative patterns. So when you make time for prayer, somehow you become so much more efficient with the rest of your life. It's the difference between having long thoughts and 5 short thoughts at once. St. Elizabeth Ann Seton said, "Never be hurried by anything whatsoever. Nothing can be more pressing than the necessity of your peace before God. You'll help others more by your own peace and tranquility of your heart than by any eagerness or care that you can bestow upon them." Okay, and then finally, let's revisit this need for optimism, this need for gratitude in our life. When it comes to parenting and the family life, is it more about achieving growth, or is it more about reaching perfection? In parenting, it's more about achieving growth. Don't be tempted to think that family life is just measured as it's successful or not, only if it's perfect. That's a huge temptation for parents. We're not talking about something that is either happens or that it doesn't happen. We're talking about a journey of raising your children with faith, and it's not something that you just accomplish, but it's something that you stay committed to. And they see that commitment, and they witness that devotion that you have. And in that faithfulness, in that devotion, in that sense of hope and trust that God is good, that they were made good, that our children were made for God, in that devotion is where we can actually be at peace. In that devotion is where we can trust. Right? Because when they see the trust in our life, that might help them more than anything else, that sense of hope. And if they see the way we love each other, that helps a lot too. Thank you.